Do y'all know everybody up here? Y'all know Bakari? Give him a big round of applause. He's from South Carolina. Clint Smith, Clint's from New Orleans, and his grandpa's over there, and his mom is there, and his daddy's there, so he's going to act right today. And Jarvis DeBerry. Jarvis, you from Mississippi?
Holly Springs, Mississippi.
Holly Springs, Mississippi. Although he's been here so many times, and he's been here so long, he actually is a New Orleanian.
Yes.
Whether he claims it or not, we claim him, so give him a round of applause. I have to say a couple of preliminary things before we start. I'm here in my individual capacity. I'm speaking only for myself. And I'm Cheryl's husband, so that's just kind of it. So it's nice, that's true. It's nice to be with all of you. And I really wanted to thank Walter Isaacson and Cheryl and the entire team and staff, all of the sponsors for putting this fantastic book festival. They've been working on this now. As you know, right before COVID hit, they were like, you think we're going to be able to go? I'm like, I don't think so. A couple months? I don't think so. And here we are 2.5 years later, and I think you'd agree with me, it's a spectacular response, right? So anyway, we have 3 really brilliant minds on the stage. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to go to Walter Isaacson's class, and I listened to Walter and Michael Lewis talk to their students, and the students were asking them, how do you write a book? How do you get it published? Tell me a little bit about writing. And essentially, the message that they tried to deliver to the students that I hope that they saw was, you can be technically good at writing, you can come up with a good subject matter, but if you can't see, if you don't have insight, if you don't have perspective, if you don't understand the undulations of how history moves in and out, you may be technically good, but you might not produce something that other people want to read. Amen? Because if you don't think good, it's hard to write good. And so these 3 gentlemen on this stage, I have been knowing quite a long time, except Bakari, who got elected. I got elected when I was 27, and I thought it was pretty good. He got elected to the legislature when he was 23 years old.
22.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry, 22, forgive me. I got to get my facts right. And Clint, I really just had the pleasure of meeting Clint just a couple years ago. I can't lie. I've been knowing his daddy a long time. And I didn't know him when he was growing up. But Jarvis knows everything about me. Jarvis wrote for the Times-Picayune when I was in office and used to write all kinds of stuff. And from time to time, I would call him and say, hey. And he would say, hey. And he is, all of them have been really visionaries and been leaders, and all 3 of them have gone on to now not only become prolific authors, but recognized thought leaders in the United States of America. So I'm grateful that they came. So give them a round of applause. So let me before we get into what we're going to talk about, let me plug y'all's books. I Feel to Believe. This is a series of. I looked at the first thing I did was what did he write about me, and he didn't write anything about me. It was amazing. But this is really the soundtrack of New Orleans and the United States of America from the time that Jarvis began writing here quite a long time ago. If you want to know anything that happened in this city, really in the state and in the country, it's in this book. So I would offer it to you. I'm gonna give it to the youngster on the stage, my Vanishing Country, from Bakari, who has written about his life and his story and what he sees and where he came from, that I'm gonna ask you a little bit about. And then this is not Clint's first book. He really kind of got into it as a poet, and then actually started doing some other stuff. Writes for The Atlantic right now, one of the best long-form magazines in the country that's got the best writers. And he has traveled the country and has wrote a book called How the Word is Passed. So show him a little bit of that. So the topic today is about the South, but I do want to ask them just 1 or 2 questions about their book. Bakari, I was really curious about why you named your book My Vanishing Country.
So one thing that people probably understand is that authors don't name their books. Your editor names your book for you. We were going to name this book Country, but when you throw country in Google, it doesn't really Google well. There are a lot of things that pop up. My Vanishing Country, though, talks of a 50,000-foot view of many of the principles that we hold dear, those not so tangible ideals such as love, hope, truth, justice, peace, that many young folks still believe in, how they're vanishing before our eyes. And then on the kind of macro level, I'm from the poor rural South, where we have 3 stoplights and a blinking light. And, we've lost our hospital. I talk about CAFTA and NAFTA, and how after CAFTA and NAFTA, many of the textile mills that we had left, and how you can really just drive down Main Street, and what used to be a record store, a Chinese food restaurant, a florist, a little theater, a bookstore, etc., are now boarded up, dilapidated buildings, and those country towns that you know are also vanishing before your eyes. And so it has a dual meaning to it. And I also urge Clint in his next book to put his face on the front of his book. I think he's the only one without a picture on the front of it. We're humble, kinda. But this picture I didn't choose this picture either. In fact, I wanted a picture of myself enveloped in a burning Confederate flag. I was going for it. It's my first book. I said, go big. I said, go big or go home. And the editor was like, probably not. So they put a picture of me. This is a true picture of me at 6 years old, headed to play summer league basketball. And my dad took this picture on 633 Frederick Street, and I still have some of that youthful innocence that I try to hold dear to. So,
Thank you. Clint?
Yeah,
Just a little bit about your book.
The origin story of this book is, like many of you, in 2017, I watched the Confederate statues come down here in New Orleans. So statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I was watching these statues come down, and I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap, but it does help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives throughout history that shape what the contemporary landscape around us looks like. And so I was looking around New Orleans and thinking about how I grew up in this city that was once the largest slave market in the country, and thinking about how that sort of narrative, that part of the story, Dr. Glaude was here before talking about the stories we tell and the stories we don't tell, and thinking about how in my own education, in my own childhood, the story of New Orleans as one of the centerpieces of slavery in this country was not really present in my classrooms and in the sort of larger narratives that were being formed about this city, this state, this country. And so I started looking around and thinking about, well, what are the places in New Orleans that are telling the story or failing to tell the story of themselves? And I think about my historian, one of my former professors, a historian named Walter Johnson, and he says of New Orleans, the whole city is a memorial to slavery. It's in the levees enslaved people built. It's in the roads enslaved people paved. It's in the soil enslaved people are buried in. It's in the buildings enslaved people constructed. And so for me, I was really interested in how the story of this place was told or how it failed to be told. And then I sort of began to broaden it out and think about, well, how do different historical sites across the country, how do different neighborhoods, different cities who have a relationship to this history, how do they tell the story of their relationship to the institution of slavery? Are they being honest about it? Are they running from it? Are they doing something in between? And ultimately spent several years traveling the country and ultimately going across the ocean to try to get a sense of how the story of slavery is told in different parts of the country. How is it told at Angola? How is it told at the Whitney? How is it told at Monticello? How is it told at a Confederate cemetery? How is it told in New York City? How is it told in Dakar, Senegal? To try to get piece together a sort of patchwork that represents the heterogeneity and plurality of public memory in this country around the way that the story of slavery is told.
Well, thank you so much. If you read Jarvis's columns, what you notice, I think that you would notice, is clear sight, a profound sense of justice, and the courage to really talk about tough issues. And so, Jarvis, what is the kind of the through line as you look back when you were deciding which one of your columns to put in, because I know that you've written an innumerable amount of them. What was the through line, that you were putting together when you wanted to decide what to include in the book?
I think you named it. Excuse me if I'm too loud. I think you named it, that there is this through line of how you adjust to this environment, especially when you consider it unjust and when you consider all of the implications of egregious acts of history that preceded your time here. I think that's also what all three of these books have in common. Bakari mentioned being from a small town in South Carolina. I'm from a small town in Mississippi. I think we had a few more stoplights than you all did. But to speak to Clint's book, one of the things that I don't think I ever mentioned in a column for the people in New Orleans, but my hometown of Holly Springs would have every April a celebration. I think they officially called it the Tour of Homes, meaning antebellum homes in the city. But colloquially, it was known as the pilgrimage. And you would have people coming from, I don't know how far, from the South. And they would essentially do Confederate cosplay through the streets of my town. You would see young boys who were maybe teenagers in Confederate grays and young girls in these big hoop skirts. And they would just put on this big display of how great the Confederacy was, right? With no acknowledgement of the evils, no acknowledgement
It's the war of northern aggression.
Correct. Correct. That's exactly what they would term it. And so I brought that history to New Orleans, and so I was always astonished by people who would say in the comments, well, you never even thought about these monuments until Mitch said something, or these things never crossed your mind. It's like, dude, I grew up in the shadow. You mentioned the shadows, your book, of seeing people just flaunt this idea that they were above us and they were superior, and look how great it was, how great life was when you all were enslaved. And so the through line of this book is it's not just focused on the monuments. I don't want you to think that, but this sense of what is life actually like in New Orleans, and I don't mean that to be exhaustive or comprehensive by any stretch, but for a particular point in time, this was what life was like, and this is what people were struggling, and how people were struggling to survive.
Thank you. We did not talk before we had this conversation, so I want to kind of stretch it out just a little bit. And Bakari does something that I have seen very few people do, is that when he starts talking about the civil rights movement, and he says, I'm a child of the civil rights movement, which is one of the first lines in your book, and you start thinking about, calling names of folks that you were hanging out with, because your daddy has a story that you can tell. I'm interested in the idea of lineage. Clint, your pawpaw's sitting right over there, and your people are from Monticello. By the way, so are my people. My great-great-grandmother was Lorena Mackey, who grew up, I've just found out, we probably related, in the same town. And Jarvis, you think about it already too, but I want you to do something for me. When you go through the colloquy of remembering who the great civil rights leaders of all time, run through that list that you have in your head.
So people, that's a good question. So people are sometimes, when I talk about the Mount Rushmore, and we probably shouldn't do this, but who cares?
No, we're going to do it.
Yeah, when I talk about like the Mount Rushmore of like civil rights leaders and icons, I always start with Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker.
Right, true that, right?
So that...
And who else?
That kind of probably puts you in some mind state or mind frame of where I come from. I add Stokely. I think that Stokely Carmichael, of course, I think that one of the greatest politicians, civil rights heroes of all time is probably Julian Bond. Uncle Julian was absolutely everything. And with all due respect, I know that Mark's was in the room. I know that Mitch is here, but there was probably no better mayor for black folk in this country than Marion Barry. Like, we can have a lot of conversations about Marion, but he created an entire new, and I think Clint Mayer probably could add some color to it, but he created an entire stratus of black middle class in Washington, D.C. I mean, it was just fascinating to see the work that he did, and the way that history looks upon him. We probably need to reframe that And so when we talk about that, those are usually the individuals who I look up to. There is a direct line between the Shirley Chisholms of the world, the Hillary Clintons of the world, the Kamala Harrises of the world, and Fannie Lou and Ella. And a lot of the things, I also, one of the other people I put on that list is somebody that many people don't talk about. Her name was Sarah Mae Fleming. Sarah actually sat on a bus some 15, 16 months before Rosa did. And so there are a lot of these stories that Mitch is talking about that we have to do a better job of telling. And that's why, God works in mysterious ways. And he worked through Cheryl to have this event at this particular time, because 2 years ago or 3 years ago, pre-COVID, this event wouldn't have been as important as it is right now. Because we have to do a better job of educating individuals on the legacy and history that people are trying to take away.
Yeah, thank you for that. And he just is profound.
I mean, you're a good mayor, but I'm just saying Marion.
Look,
Marion was slightly better. I mean, if
every
we don't rank
time I
him,
see my brother Mark, he reminds me that he was better than I was. And when I see Ambassador Young, he does the same thing. And watch this. Who beat Julian Bond in a race for Congress?
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that race. I talk about that race in here.
No,
that race.
Just
John Lewis won that race. That race was one of the more fascinating races that anyone will ever. And I talk about it briefly, and I dare not go too deep into it. There was an incident where Congressman Lewis, who I love and adore, he would always advise me to walk onto the pages of history. That was his advice. He'd be prepared. CL is what they call me. My dad's name is Cleveland Lewis, so they call me Little CL. He would always say, Little CL, be prepared to walk onto the pages of history. At one point in time, he did look at Julian and challenge Julian to a drug test, and it got sideways, and it truly fractured the movement. It's one of the it's one of the stories that is a fascinating story that I won't go into.
Yeah, another day. But I just wanted to just when you think about these two great men who history has now looked back on and who have gone on to do incredible things, they actually ran against each other.
They ran against each other.
One time, it did not act particularly well during that race. Just a little.
And people don't know this. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to take 30 seconds. People don't know this, but they didn't speak to each other for decades. Like this wasn't like a simple thing. Like they didn't speak to each other Julian Bond and John Lewis did not talk to each other.
It's kind of like our families during COVID when we were getting in arguments.
Yeah, exactly. But they made some peace before they. On
the issue of lineage, in Clint's book, he does this, and Clint, I know your papa's here, but he starts saying the grandfather of my grandfather was enslaved, and that lineage, right. That did something for you, right? And you started thinking about that. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so I end the book, the epilogue is conversations with my maternal grandfather who's here, and then my paternal grandmother. And part of what I wanted to do was that I'd spent these years going across the country, talking to people, talking to strangers, and asking them these in-depth questions of their lives and what was their relationship, their personal lineage with regard to the history of slavery. And I realized that I had never brought that same level of intentionality to my own family. And there was a moment where I was pushing my grandfather. We were at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. I was pushing my grandfather through the museum, and my grandmother's walking a few paces ahead of us. And I realized that so much of the history that is documented in this museum, so much of the violence that is documented in this museum are things that they experienced and lived through firsthand. And when I talked to my grandmother after, she had this refrain she kept saying. She was like, I lived it. I lived it. I lived it. And I think all the time about that museum, and I think about how the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture was a woman named Ruth Bonner, who opened the museum alongside the Obama family in 2016. And she sort of rang the bell, which was the sort of commemorative opening of the museum. And Ruth Bonner was the daughter of someone who was born into slavery. Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. She was the daughter, a woman alive in 2016, of someone born into intergenerational chattel slavery. And so the thing about this history is that we tell ourselves that this history was a long time ago, when in fact it wasn't that long ago at all. Slavery existed in this country for over 250 years, and it's only not existed for a little over 150. So you have an institution that existed for a century longer than it has, an institution in which there are people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people born into bondage. And people want to suggest that it has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality. People want to suggest that it is irrelevant to the reason that one community looks one way and another community looks another way. And that is revealed to be profoundly, morally, and intellectually disingenuous. And so part of what the book is attempting to do is in attempting to give us a sense of our collective physical proximity to this history, right? How the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us, that it will also give us a sense of our temporal proximity to this history and disabuse us of the idea that this history is somehow irrelevant to what, again, the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like, and that we have to account for it and have to account for the fact that we, again, are still living in a moment in which that institution existed for a century longer than it hasn't, and that doesn't even account for, the history of Jim Crow, the history of the aftermath of Reconstruction, mass criminalization, mass incarceration, the list goes on.
Mitch, real quick, how many black folk in the room? How many black folk in this? Wow, that was impressive. How many black folk in this room have a parent or parents who went to segregated schools? Or went to a segregated school? Yeah. And there are very few black folk with their hands down, which just shows you, to your point, how you can touch history, how it's not that far.
I mean, Ruby Bridges is
still
around. She's
around.
like out
in her
here
60s.
She's doing Zumba class somewhere. Like bringing her grandkids to soccer games. Like, I mean, I think it's just so easy with the Eyes on the Prize documentaries or the black and white images in our textbooks to convince ourselves that this era is on, like the way that I was taught about slavery as a kid was as if it was in the Jurassic period. Like it was the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery, like all existing at the same time. And that's how so many young people are taught about it. And then, again, that doesn't even account for the civil rights movement. My mother was the first person among the first cohort to integrate her elementary school, right? And so this is here. This is right now.
Well, she's right there. Stand up, Mama, so they can see you. Just stand up. Clint, sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you. Clint, while I ask this next, Jarvis, I want you to get ready, but Clint, would you mind turning to the last sentence in your book and reading it as we get it? Because it's the next segue into what I want to talk about next. And I want
of the book?
to lay this out to you. The last sentence.
It's a long book, Clint.
Oh, man.
My father, who many of you know, is 91 years old. And in the regard of what Clint was saying, would say to me, I remember my grandmother really well, and my grandmother actually was in the presence of, touched, and was part of the community that was enslaved. And my father touches me every day. And so, because he says the same thing, I don't know why everybody keeps saying this was a long time ago. It is, in fact, a part of his life, and it's a part of mine on the lineage piece. Would you just read the last?
The last sentence?
Yeah, just the last sentence.
At some point, it is no longer a question of whether we can learn this history, but whether we have the collective will to reckon with it.
Amen. So that's what I want to talk about now. I'm going to frame this up, and this is just, again, my thoughts. We have this kind of idea in our head about the old South versus the new South. What does that really mean? What's it look like? When Dr. King left us, the last book that he wrote was Where Do We Go From Here?, which is the topic of the discussion today. And it occurred to me from all the time that y'all were wonderful enough to let me serve you that we watched our intellectual capital. We watched our creative talent. We watched our children just leave the South. After slavery was legally ended, basically 4 million of the best and the brightest that existed in America went other places. They went to New York. They went to Detroit, the Great Migration that is written about so incredibly in Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. If you think about it, when I'm traveling around, I don't know about y'all, but I meet people and I look at them and think, man, you look familiar. Where you from? And if you check them out long enough, especially if they're from Los Angeles and they're cooking good, they're people from here, right? Like they all from the South. Everybody's from the damn South. I'm like, how did y'all get up here? So this like the reverse migration. I just started thinking about why Louisiana, why the South has suffered, and why we keep doing that. And if we lost so much by expelling the best and the brightest, what possibly could we gain if we really thought about what the South ought to look like and ought to be like? And so we're in this moment now. You know, 3 young, smart, attractive, brilliant black men that would not be sitting here some time ago, that have watched this country in the last 6 years do things that you never thought, or maybe you didn't think that we would ever do again, or maybe you did. And it feels to me, and I think, Bakari, I agree with you, that it feels very familiar historically, especially after slavery ended, and then we had Reconstruction, and then all of a sudden there was the clap. I call it the clap back. I call it the reversion. And it feels like that to me now. And I'm wondering how y'all are feeling about the last 6 years. I think I know. But I'm interested in what you're thinking about where we're going and how we're going to get there, what it's going to take, and what it would look like if we could get everybody back again. Jarvis, that's for you.
Well, the backlash is real and obvious and undeniable. And the idea that a person as moderate as Barack Obama would spawn the vitriol that we saw and have seen. You know, I try to exist in these two worlds where I keep my skeptical hat on as a journalist, but my optimistic self as a real life human being. So I don't know that I can say that I did not see it coming, because there has been no progress that black people have made that white people have accepted or not responded violently to. Bakari mentioned and asked about segregated schools. My parents didn't go to school with any white people. I went to school with very few white people, and I need to ask if my niece, who is in my hometown, goes to school with any white people. If she does, I would doubt that there are many at all. And so despite 1954, despite Brown v. Board, what the white South did was say, okay, we don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're still not going to allow this, we're still not going to do this. So there's always been a backlash. And nor has there ever been a black liberation movement or a black civil rights leader that white people have supported in real time. It just doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened. So we should not be surprised that the election of a black president led to what we have seen and continue to see.
That is very fascinating and true. I refuse to give talks about Dr. King because his legacy was so whitewashed, and the data point that I always go to is his last Gallup approval poll rating, which was lower than Donald Trump's at any point throughout
I think it was 63% negative.
Oh yeah, it was like he had a 31% approval rating or something before he died, which is kind of surreal. But I want to go to one, and I don't mean to be sensationalized, but I want to go to one more touch point to further talk about what you were discussing, which is the violence that is associated with the terror that many people go through. And I am someone who believes that we have not had any progressive political policy changes in this country without black blood flowing through the streets. And so people would say, well, what do you mean, Bakari? And I say, well, it took the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it took Jimmy Lee, it took Medgar, it took Emmett to get the 1964-65 Voting Rights Act. White folk had to see people get bludgeoned on the bridge for them to really understand what was happening. You wouldn't have the Fair Housing Act, and if people want to go back and look at 68 and the assassination of King, the Fair Housing Act only passed because King was assassinated. I mean, to bring it up to speed, we wouldn't have even taken down the Confederate flag but for 9 black folk being killed in a church.
That's a fact.
You wouldn't even have a conversation about police reform if George Floyd, and I wanted to pinpoint this because I see Clint kind of nodding, so I'm sure he's going to jump in. And when we get you on TV, Clint, when you get the CNN contract, you got to start jumping in a little bit more.
That's all you, man.
This is where you would jump in.
Yeah, that's where you would.
Right here. And you hit him when you do it.
I'm throwing him these lobs, and Clint just got to jump in.
I'm missing the alleys.
Yeah, you are. But I will tell you this, that the fascinating thing about George Floyd is this. George Floyd would not have we would not have had the response to George Floyd if we weren't in a pandemic. I firmly believe that. Because y'all had to sit at home and they had nowhere to go and watch this 9-minute video over and over and over again. And so to actually get accountability, not justice, justice is George Floyd at home, that's a totally other speech. What black folk got was accountability, which is extremely rare, but it's not justice. But in order to get accountability, you had to have a video, so it had to be on camera. You had to have a very courageous 16-year-old black teenager named Danella Frazier, who actually stopped and took the picture and took the video. You had to be in the middle of a pandemic, and you had to have the entire world protest. That's all it took.
Wow. Clint?
And I would just add that I think part of what's,
That's good jumping in.
and
Well, look, wait, on this note, Bakari and I were on CNN together, and I can attest to this, so get ready for this. He would be like elbowing me and jumping all on my lines and everything, and I'd be like, man, he goes, that's the way it is here. It's like roller derby. You got to jump
Bakari?
in. Yeah, him.
No, that's all you. I mean, part of what I think is interesting, too, when we think about backlash is that we just commemorated or recognized the 10th anniversary of Trayvon Martin's death, which is understood informally as the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's been a decade in which black activists have been, or on the street, black organizers, especially on a local level, have been doing work that has been in many ways catalyzed by Trayvon Martin and then Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Nisha McBride, so many others, obviously leading up to Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery.
Do you hear the lineage?
I mean, and so part of what I think is true is that what has happened is that over the past 10 years, there's been a profound shift in public consciousness, not with everybody, but with many people, in which more people have begun to understand the history of racism, not just as an interpersonal phenomenon, but as a historical one, as a sociological one, as a state-sanctioned one, as a policy-oriented one. And part of what has happened is that, again, not without its imperfections and its inconsistencies, but you've had millions of people who are now beginning to understand a newer, more expansive, more pluralistic, more inclusive story about this country, getting a set of perspectives about parts of this history that they may not have been exposed to before. And I think part of what we've seen this summer with, I call it like critical race theory summer, was that you had, because there are millions of people who are experiencing a shift in their own understanding of the history of this country as a result of the books that so many of us have been able to write that are only possible because of the work that activists and organizers on the ground have done. I mean, it was the same thing in the civil rights movement. The civil rights activists were out here creating space that allowed for a new generation of historians, journalists, writers like Baldwin to come and tell new stories about this country that shifted people's understanding of this country. So you have these people who shifted their understanding of this country, but for a lot of other people, that shift in consciousness represents like an existential threat to who they believe themselves to be. Because if who you understand yourself to be is tied to the previous story of America, it's tied to a story of America that has been revealed to be two-dimensional and sort of a caricature of itself, that talks about America as the shining light on the hill, manifest destiny as being an this unparalleled good, is never talking about black history, never talking about indigenous genocide, never talking about the violence that different immigrant groups have experienced. If your sense of who you are is tied to that story of America, and more people, and fewer people are believing that story of America, you don't experience it as just an inconvenient reassessment of history, you experience it as a threat to your very sense of self, which is why I think that we have now state-sanctioned efforts in state legislatures and school boards across the country who are attempting to prevent teachers from teaching the very history that explains why our country looks the way that it does today, because they know that if a more expansive story of this country continues to be told, that it will call into question the stories that they have told about themselves and the stories that they have told about their families and their communities. And I think that is the sort of current manifestation we see with critical race theory and the book banning, is that people are scared. They're scared because they don't know who they are without this fictional story of America, because then they're worried that the story that they have about themselves is also fiction.
And on Fox News, they're saying it out loud. I mean, on Fox News, they're saying it out loud. It's the fear of being replaced. It's the fear of
And they say it very directly.
demographics changing, and also the fear that they will be treated by the non-white majority the way that they have treated other people who are minority. I will never forget a white high school classmate who had, I think, a 34 on the ACT, asking me and another black classmate, if I applied to Jackson State, you think they would let me in? Seriously, so you think Jackson State exists to keep white people out? Like is that really what you have grown up believing? That these black schools exist so white people won't come in and not the other way around? But I do think that there, like you said, there is this existential threat, this fear of being replaced, seeing that the world is changing, most evidently in the Obamas being in the White House, and not knowing how to respond to that except through violence, and taking the levers of legislation and saying, we're gonna halt this.
But it's different now to a certain extent, right? Because I'm old enough to remember when being racist wasn't cool. But even more importantly, there's something happening in our world, right? I usually ask folk this question, and I won't do it here because of time, but I usually say, what was the most amazing thing or the thing that just made you drop your jaw in Charlottesville? And people will say the anti-Semitism, or they'll say the racism, or they'll say the fact that these guys went and got like khakis and tiki torches. And I'm like, nah, the most amazing thing is that they ain't wear no mask. Like, none of them covered their faces. Like, it's okay to be that vile and to be that racist and to chant Jews shall not replace us and blood and soil and death to niggers and all this other stuff and go back to work. So when people talk about systems of injustice, we're not talking about just the vile racist slurs that we get on a daily basis, I'm sure, but we're talking about systems, and these people are participating in systems. But to even think a little bit more critical about the fear that people have, my grandma would always say you can't fall off the floor, right? Some things old folks say that don't make sense until you get older.
Got to love Mama.
And then you're like, wait.
You're like, all right, grandma, she need to take a medicine. But like, you can't fall off the floor and it makes sense now, right? But there are a lot of us right now who are on the floor together. Like, for example, my heart breaks for trans kids right now, right? And people start now people get uncomfortable, right? Because the conversation gets real, because you cannot be selfish in your struggle. Like if I'm out here, and I think this is where we end up in this conversation, if I'm out here protesting for women's rights, right? If I'm out here just saying that, or reproductive rights, then I expect you to be with me protesting when another unarmed black man is killed. And black folk, I expect you to have the same level of exertion when they're now persecuting trans kids in Florida. Like, well, I mean, the list is going to grow. It's going to be 16 states in the South, and you can just add on to it. But I'm just saying that is where we end up, Mitch, where you can't be selfish in your struggle.
And when they came for me, nobody was there.
Exactly.
And y'all remember James Baldwin said, well, you know, I love my country so much, that's why I reserve the right to criticize her. Now, I'm making an executive decision right now not to take questions because we only got 5 minutes left, and these guys are lighting up the room. Would y'all rather talk, or you want to hear them talk? All right. See, I can make an executive decision. I appreciate it. That's when you get to be the man. That's a good thing. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. So you sit here and you just we only have about 5 minutes left. Well, I know we could stay here all day, and I'm so honored to be in the presence of these gentlemen. What do you, y'all got young kids. So how you feeling for them? And where do you think we're going? And what do you tell them about whether you can help make the world safe or not? What are we looking at in the South in the next 10 years? And I put 10 on it on purpose. Don't give me 20, because everybody can say anything can happen in 20. I mean, like, what do you really think? Where are we going and how are we going to get there? Go ahead, Jarvis.
I think that's the scariest part of any black parent, is how you send your children out into the world. I saw something, I didn't see something, I read something by James Weldon Johnson where he talks about the debate that black parents had even at the turn of the 20th century. There were some who wanted to shield their children from racism, and there were some who wanted to really instruct their children about the racism they would face. And he said he couldn't tell the difference either way, which method worked. You know, you were still gonna suffer it, and so it didn't matter if your parents had warned you about it or not. I don't want to kill the hope and optimism I see in my child's eyes when she plays with her friends who are not black. At the same time, I don't want to send her out into the world naive about the envy that people will have because she has some level of success. And I think we sometimes think of the backlash in the wrong way. Sometimes the backlash is simply a black person doing well. I mean, that is the story of Tulsa. It's the story of Rosewood. It's the story of so many. It's the story of the bomb threats being called into HBCUs right now. We don't like to see you succeed, and we don't like to see you do well. And so I don't want to like saddle my child with this cynicism and this wariness, but I also don't want to do the opposite. And so it's a constant struggle. And some days I'm one way, and some days I'm another. But you know, the impulse is always out of love, but I'm not always sure that I'm doing exactly the right thing.
Thank you. Clint.
The thing I always tell people, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but you know, as I mentioned, the first enslaved people came to the British American colonies in 1619. Emancipation Proclamation didn't happen until 1863, so the 13th Amendment didn't happen until 1865. But what's true is that from the moment black people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. And what that also means is that the vast majority of black people who were fighting for liberation never got a chance to see it or experience it for themselves. But that doesn't mean that what they were fighting for didn't matter, because my life is only possible because of generations of people who fought for something that they knew they might never see, but fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think that that is the sort of responsibility that is bestowed upon each of us, to recognize that we are all collectively attempting to build a better world, and that we might not see that version of the world in our lifetimes. But we don't do it so that we see the fruits of our own labor. We do it because we know that someday someone will, because that's what other people have done for us. And I think that that's part of the black tradition in this country, right? Is this recognition that you don't fight for something only so you can experience it. You fight for something because you know that someday someone will. It's like we're all chipping away at this wall. And you don't know if the wall is 6 inches thick or 600 miles thick. But you know the more you chip away at it, the less the people who come after you will have to chip away at. And at some point, you're going to see the light on the other side of that wall. You don't know when it is, but you know that your work in chipping away at that wall is important to the person that comes after you. And so that's the sort of thing that I hope to share with my kids, you know? That's the sort of thing where it's like, your life is only possible because of my grandfather and his grandfather and his grandmother and their grandfather. And so the work that we need to try to do in our own lives is to continue that struggle, because that is part of the lineage and tradition that we're a part of.
Thank you. Bakari, and tell them your kids' names.
Oh, Sadie and Stokely. Yeah, Sadie. And that's Stokely after Stokely Carmichael, and Sadie after Sadie Mays, who was married to Benjamin Elijah Mays, who's the greatest educator of all time.
Lineage.
So, you know, I'm going to be really quick. So in my household, first of all, I have twins. They're 3 years old, so they're buy one, get one free today, if anybody wants one. All this love your children stuff is cool, but I'm tired, so y'all come pick them up when you feel like it. But, you know, I do two things in my household, which I think that a lot of people do. I don't get the parenting thing. I'm not sure I do it right, but I just try to do it every day. The first thing is black folk have this onus on us, and some other groups, but particularly black folk, where we have to love our neighbors, even when they don't love us. And that is really, really a weird existence. That's a pressure type of existence that most other groups in this country don't have. And so I give my kids a lot of love, right? They know their house is filled with love because when they go outside, they know how difficult it would be. So my kids be like, how much does daddy love me? And they all know that daddy loves them this much. So we just make sure that the house is filled with love, right? And that's because you got to exert a whole lot of it so you don't go around hating folk.
when you go outside. I mean, hate is a horrible burden to bear. And the last thing that I'll tell you with my time is that we're reframing the way black folk think, particularly about that wall that he was talking about. Because my kids aren't going to be on this planet to just survive. I'm tired of black folks surviving every day. You know, we will talk collectively about, man, we made it. We just got to survive through this. My kids are going to thrive, though, right? And so we try to, it's hard, but we try to reform the way they think about their existence through those things.
Let me say this. This was unbelievable. When I get to feeling a little bit down and I ask how the future's going to be, the line forms to the right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Y'all are beautiful.